Hello, and welcome to this download from Blackwell Online. My name is George Miller, and my guest today is Aravind Adiga, who surprised the bookies by winning the 2008 Booker Prize with his first novel. One critic called the book the perfect antidote to lyrical India. Much of the power of the novel derives from the voice of its narrator, Balram Halwai. He's not the sort of character usually given centre stage in Indian novels. He comes from a low caste in a backward, almost feudal village. His lot in life seems to be that of the downtrodden servant, mistreated by his affluent, westernised masters. Yet over the course of several nights, he relates the steps he took to turn himself into a self-made entrepreneur. I asked Aravind Adiga how the character of Balram had taken shape.
I was a journalist in India for Time magazine from 2003 to the end of 2005, and in the course of my work I travelled a lot throughout India, and I'd meet people in different parts of India, people whom I wouldn't meet had I just stayed, I wouldn't have met had I stayed on in Delhi or in a big city. So Balram is a composite of many people I met when I was travelling and people I talked to. So he's not one particular person as much as a kind of synthesis of numerous men who are making the transition from their villages to a city.
You say, or he says in the book, that I think on two occasions he says that he could be half the men in India. So there's obviously a sense in which he represents something.
Sure, because he comes from a part of India that's the part along the Ganges that is one of the most densely populated parts of India, and something like over 400 million Indians live in that part of the country. But generally, the man I've described, of medium height with a moustache, kind of thin, is the physical and dark skin, is a physical characteristic, he looks like half the men in India. I also meant that a lot of my readers, presumably the middle class in India, don't necessarily look like this. They tend to be a bit taller because they've been better fed. Often they're lighter skinned, clean shaven typically. So Balram belongs to that half of India that's not doing particularly well. That's the second point in calling him, someone who could be half of Indians.
One of the things I really liked about the book is that it is written in the form of an address to the Premier of China. Balram is explaining his life and his situation, what makes his life typical, to the Chinese Premier. And I wondered, at what stage did you hit upon that as a way of developing the narrative?
Well, the idea that he would be talking to someone was integral to it because, as I said, this was the voice is a synthesis of conversations I had had with many men, and this was them talking to me. So in a sense, Balram was talking to me as the novel came into being, and when I was actually writing it down, I got replaced by the Chinese Premier because it struck me that Indians are always in conversation with people from other countries about their own country. That is, our sense of self is profoundly influenced by the way outsiders see us. I think possibly because of our long colonial history. And what has happened in the past 10 years is that the outsider we compare ourselves to is no longer the West, but it's become China. And as China develops fast, it begins to occupy so much attention all over the world, including in India. And Indians are particularly fascinated by China because on the one hand there are these resemblances, two giant nations with an ancient history. On the other hand, China has developed so unlike India, and it's such an antithesis of India. It's industrial, it's urban, its population is stabilizing, and India is doing none of those things. It's still rural, it's not particularly industrial, it's just gradually industrializing, its population is still growing. And Indians tend to see China as the other, so it became natural that if Balram was talking to someone else, he would be talking to someone from China.
When we in the West think about India and China, one of the key differences we think of is that India is democratic.
Right. The part of India that Balram comes from is not a particularly good example of democracy in action. Most of India is quite democratic, but in parts of India, people have trouble exercising their right to vote. And even when they do vote, their choice is really limited to a couple of very rotten politicians. What Balram is doing, and what I'm trying to get the reader to think about is this idea of democracy being necessary and sufficient for a country to progress. Because often I think that democracy is one of those things we just take for granted as something that's absolutely good. It's an irony of history that China, an undemocratic country, has done a much better job in feeding, clothing, and educating its poor than India, a democratic country, has done in the past 60 years. If you were a poor person and you had a choice where you wanted to live in India or China, I mean, you would have to pick China in every respect. You'd be better educated, you'd be better fed, your wife would probably not die at childbirth. So it's just something, I wanted to be a bit provocative here, because I fear that in India, the idea that we are a democracy and everything will be okay has taken root too deeply, and people get smug and complacent because it's a democracy. And you can be a democracy and you can still fail the vast majority of people who live in your country, which to some extent has happened in India.
The world of Balram is very different from the view of India that we often see reflected in literature in the West. It's a complete, I think one of the reviewers said it's an antidote to a lyrical view of India.
Right. The view of India that emerges from novels is often, a middle-class view. The characters are either middle class or upper class. And even if they tend to be poor, they still think of the world in a middle-class sort of way. That is, they believe in the institutions around them. They believe that if they keep pushing, things will get better. Now, what I've tried to do is write a novel from the point of view of someone at the bottom in India, and that is an entirely different way of looking at the world from the way a middle-class person would look at the world. And it tends to be a much harsher, more brutal view of life that poor people in India tend to have, a much more fatalistic, cynical view of the world. So this is an attempt to write something from the point of view of someone at the bottom of society, and that in doing so, it does end up being different from most other novels written by Indians.
Were you consciously writing against that representation? I mean, sometimes I wondered if there was a certain sort of anger sort of fueling that view of India, a sort of impatience that Balram's India is so little represented in writing.
I can't say I was consciously doing that. I was challenging certain held notions about India, but this is not necessarily, like for instance the idea of the Indian family, which is constantly eulogized in literature, but not just in literature, in Indian society in general. I think I was consciously trying to take on certain values and certain ideas about India held in India by the middle class. I wasn't consciously writing against the portrayal of India in other novels in English. It just so happens that the kind of person I am writing about is hardly ever depicted in fiction, and just being honest to his views and his worldview creates a voice that is very different and very unusual and very unlike anything that you normally see.